The frozen seas of the Arctic became a graveyard during World War II. Between 1941 and 1945, Allied ships carried vital supplies to the Soviet Union through waters so deadly that Churchill called it the worst journey in the world. German U-boats, bombers, and the battleship Tirpitz hunted them, but often the cold itself killed faster than bullets. For thousands of sailors, there were no graves, no bodies, no return, only vanished convoys swallowed by ice and silence. This is the story of the men who sailed, and the 89% who never came back. In the summer of 1941, when Hitler's armies poured into the Soviet Union, Moscow turned to the Allies for help. Factories in Leningrad and Moscow were being bombed, supply lines were collapsing, and the Soviet Union desperately needed equipment, fuel, and food to keep fighting. The only way to get it there quickly was by sea. Thus began one of the most dangerous naval operations of the entire war, the Arctic Convoys. From Britain and Iceland, merchant ships loaded with tanks, Spitfires, ammunition, and fuel set sail into the frozen north. Their destination was the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, which remained just barely open despite the ice. The route seemed almost suicidal. Ships had to pass within striking distance of Nazi-occupied Norway, where German U-boats lurked in wolf packs, and the Luftwaffe launched bombing raids almost daily. Above them, the constant threat of the battleship Tirpitz loomed, a vessel so powerful that even rumors of its presence could scatter an entire convoy. Yet even without the Germans, nature itself was a killer. The Arctic was merciless. Temperatures dropped so low that steel decks froze into slick sheets of ice, turning every step into a death trap. Ice built up so heavily on the superstructures of ships that crews were forced to hack at it with axes just to keep vessels from capsizing. For the men standing watch on deck, frostbite came within minutes, and those unlucky enough to fall into the water stood no chance. In seas that cold, a man's body would shut down in less than 3 minutes. Survivors described hearing the screams of comrades cut short as the ice swallowed them whole. Churchill himself admitted the truth. The worst journey in the world, he called it, and he was right. Sailors knew the odds. They could calculate them in the faces of the men standing next to them, faces that might vanish tomorrow under the waves. Still, convoy after convoy sailed, because without them, the Soviet front might have collapsed entirely. It was a lifeline made of flesh and steel, one that demanded horrific sacrifices. Of all the Arctic convoys, none symbolized the nightmare more than PQ-17. In late June 1942, 35 merchant ships, escorted by destroyers and corvettes, left Iceland carrying 297 aircraft, hundreds of tanks, and nearly 600 vehicles bound for the Soviet front. For days they braved storms and prowling U-boats, clinging to the hope that their escorts could protect them. But on July 4th, disaster struck, not from the Germans, but from the very orders meant to keep them safe. British intelligence reported that the battleship Tirpitz had left its Norwegian fjord and was steaming toward the convoy. First Sea Lord Admiral Dudley Pound panicked. Convinced the convoy would be obliterated, he issued a single, devastating command: scatter. The escorts were ordered to withdraw and hunt Tirpitz, leaving the merchantmen alone in enemy-infested waters. For the sailors aboard, the order felt like a death sentence. Ships broke formation, each one trying to slip away through the gray mist. Instead, they became easy prey. German U-boats and Luftwaffe bombers descended on the scattered ships like wolves tearing apart a flock of sheep. One by one, merchant vessels erupted in flames, their cargo exploding as bombs and torpedoes ripped through their hulls. Survivors clung to rafts, surrounded by burning oil slicks. Many were never seen again, their bodies dragged under by the weight of the icy sea. By the time the massacre ended, only 11 ships had reached Arkhangelsk. 24 had been sunk. Thousands of tons of supplies meant for the Red Army now rested on the ocean floor. The human toll was even worse. Of the hundreds of sailors who had set out, barely a fraction survived. Families back home received telegrams confirming their loved ones were missing, but no bodies were ever returned. PQ-17 became a synonym for betrayal, a convoy sacrificed by fear and poor decisions. To this day, survivors who lived through it recall a single thought as their ships went down: we were abandoned to die. For every convoy that set sail, the dangers doubled. One enemy was human, the other mercilessly natural. German U-boats prowled like sharks beneath the black Arctic waters, waiting for ships to break formation or lag behind. Above, Luftwaffe bombers swept down in waves, dropping their payloads on convoys trapped in narrow seas with nowhere to run. The air was filled with the scream of dive bombers, the thunder of anti-aircraft guns, and the roar of explosions tearing ships apart. Survivors described ships split in two, their decks engulfed in fire before they slipped beneath the waves, leaving only burning oil slicks and scattered lifeboats bobbing in the freezing spray. But even when the guns were silent, nature was just as deadly. The Arctic Ocean was a vast, frozen graveyard. Men lived in constant fear of going overboard because they knew what awaited them. In water that cold, shock set in instantly, freezing lungs and numbing muscles. Sailors had no more than 2 or 3 minutes before their hearts stopped. Rescue was nearly impossible. Lifeboats capsized in rough seas, and icy winds cut through wet clothing like knives. Then there was the ice. Gales drove massive floes into the path of convoys, splintering ships and forcing them into dangerous detours. Ice built up on every surface of a ship until it threatened to capsize entire vessels. Crews hacked desperately at the frozen weight, fingers bleeding through torn gloves. Storms could scatter whole convoys, leaving ships alone in the Arctic night. And isolation meant death. Survivors later recalled drifting on rafts as the northern lights shimmered overhead, watching their friends slip silently into the black water around them. The Arctic gave no mercy. A torpedo could sink a ship in minutes, but the cold claimed lives far quicker. Many sailors feared the sea more than the Germans because, at least against a bomber, you had a chance to fight back. Against the ice and the cold, there was no defense, only endurance. And for most, that endurance failed. When the convoys were destroyed, there were rarely bodies to bury. Ships sank in waters too deep, too cold, and too remote for recovery. Survivors often spoke of watching comrades disappear beneath the surface, their life jackets glowing faintly before being swallowed by the sea. The Arctic kept its dead, entombing them in steel coffins miles beneath the waves. Families back home received telegrams of missing at sea, but they never saw a coffin, never stood at a grave. For thousands, closure never came. More than 100 merchant ships and nearly 20 warships were lost in the Arctic convoys. Over 3,000 sailors never came home. Many were trapped inside their ships as they went down, carried to the bottom with tanks, planes, and cargo still secured in their holds. Others were thrown into the sea and vanished within minutes, their frozen bodies drifting under ice floes before being lost forever. Even decades later, wrecks discovered by divers remain silent tombs, untouched memorials in the cold dark. For the families, the loss was devastating. A mother might wait by the window for years, hoping her son would walk through the door. A wife might keep her husband's uniform folded in a drawer, clinging to the hope he was still alive somewhere. But the Arctic gave nothing back. It was not like the battlefields of Europe, where at least there were cemeteries. These men became ghosts of the sea, remembered only by names etched on memorial walls in Britain, Canada, and Russia. Sailors who did survive often carried guilt heavier than the seas themselves. They spoke of nightmares in which the voices of their lost crewmates echoed in the darkness. Some refused to talk about it at all, locking their memories away until the end of their lives. The Arctic convoys were more than battles. They were journeys into oblivion. For most who sailed, there was no return, no grave, and no remembrance beyond the endless silence of the frozen sea. The title of this story, 89% of Arctic convoy sailors never reached Russia alive, reflects the crushing reality many of these men faced. The numbers were not always uniform across every convoy, but for those caught in the worst moments, survival really did feel like a 1 in 10 chance. Convoy PQ-17, the most infamous disaster, saw 35 merchant ships scatter across the ice-filled Barents Sea. Only 11 arrived at their Soviet destinations. 24 ships were lost to U-boats, bombers, and relentless torpedoes. Of the nearly 3,000 men who set out, barely a fraction lived to see land. For those who died, there were no bodies recovered, just names entered into ledgers and telegrams sent home to stunned families. On paper, the overall record of the Arctic convoys looks better. Out of roughly 1,400 merchant vessels dispatched from 1941 to 1945, over 85% reached their destinations. But statistics rarely tell the true story. For the men aboard, the odds were felt not in numbers, but in screams cut short by freezing waves, in the sight of ships burning in the midnight sun, and in the grim reality that every voyage might be their last. Convoys like PQ-18 that followed PQ-17 also endured massive losses. 13 merchant ships sunk in just days. Survivors often later said the fear of sailing north again after PQ-17 was worse than the battle itself. When you compare the convoys to other theaters of war, the odds are staggering. U-boat crews had a 75% casualty rate, one of the worst in history. But for sailors on doomed Arctic convoys, the numbers could spike even higher. Once ships were hit, death was almost guaranteed. Men could not survive long in Arctic waters. Even if a convoy technically delivered its cargo, many of the sailors never came back. This is why so many veterans called the Arctic route suicide runs. The 89% figure may sound exaggerated, but for those who watched 9 ships vanish for every one that made it, it was reality. Amid the horror, there were moments of defiance and extraordinary survival that revealed the human spirit at its strongest. Sailors fought not just against the Germans, but against the elements themselves. Rescue operations were frantic, often carried out under fire. Escort destroyers would turn back toward burning wrecks, pulling survivors from the freezing water while bombs fell all around them. Men who collapsed on the deck were stripped of wet clothing, wrapped in blankets, and massaged back to life with hot tea forced between their lips. Every saved life was a small miracle. One account tells of a sailor from a torpedoed ship who clung to a floating hatch for hours. His hands were so frozen to the wood that rescuers had to peel his fingers away. Against all odds, he lived. Another survivor remembered floating in an oil slick, surrounded by corpses, when a corvette finally pulled him aboard. He said the silence of the dead stayed with him longer than the memory of the flames. Convoys also witnessed acts of raw bravery from crews who refused to abandon their posts. Gunners kept firing their anti-aircraft guns even as their ships sank beneath them. Radio operators sent out SOS signals until the moment water reached their stations. Captains ordered their men to abandon ship while they remained behind. The tradition of going down with the ship turning into literal sacrifice. Yet even in rescue, survival was never guaranteed. Many who were dragged aboard lifeboats or rafts succumbed to hypothermia hours later. Others were left adrift when storms scattered their rescuers. The sea claimed them quietly, long after the battle had ended. For those who lived, survival became a burden. They carried scars, frost-bitten limbs, shattered nerves, and memories of shipmates lost forever. The Arctic convoys produced heroes, but not the kind celebrated with parades. Their heroism was silent, their victories measured in breaths stolen back from a sea that wanted them dead. Behind every convoy that vanished into the Arctic, there were families left waiting. Telegrams arrived with blunt words, "Missing at sea," or "Presumed dead." For the mothers, wives, and children back home, there were no bodies to bury, no final letters, and no closure. They mourned in silence, staring at empty chairs and folded uniforms, knowing the sea had swallowed their loved ones whole. Some families clung to hope for years, imagining their sons stranded somewhere in Russia or hiding in neutral Sweden, refusing to accept that the cold Arctic had claimed them. Survivors bore their own torment. Men who returned often felt unworthy, plagued by survivors' guilt. They would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, hearing the phantom voices of friends who had screamed for help as the sea dragged them down. Some refused to talk about it for decades, burying their memories beneath silence. Others, when they did speak, often broke down mid-sentence, unable to relive the horror. Even within the convoys, the toll was crushing. Medical officers saw men lose fingers and toes to frostbite, amputating limbs by dim lantern light in storm-tossed cabins. Chaplains read last rites over shipmates before lowering them into seas that instantly consumed the bodies. Rescue crews had to look into the eyes of dying men, knowing they could not save everyone. Many of them admitted later that the guilt of choosing whom to pull aboard and whom to leave stayed with them until their final days. The Soviets never forgot these sacrifices. To them, every convoy that braved the Arctic was a lifeline that kept their cities alive. But for the sailors themselves, the cost was unbearable. Over 3,000 Allied men never returned. Their names are etched into memorials in Liverpool, Reykjavik, and Murmansk. But for their families, the memory is much more personal. The sound of a knock on the door, the telegram in hand, and the realization that the sea had taken everything. By late 1943, the Allies began to adapt. The disasters of PQ-17 and PQ-18 had revealed every vulnerability, and measures were taken to reduce the staggering losses. Convoys were given heavier escort protection. Destroyers, corvettes, and even aircraft carriers joined the routes. Long-range patrol planes flew from Iceland and northern Scotland, sweeping the skies and seas ahead of the convoys to drive back U-boats and bombers. Radar technology allowed escorts to spot submarines lurking beneath the surface, and depth charges became more effective at forcing wolf packs to scatter. The battleship Tirpitz, which had loomed as a constant threat, was finally neutralized. After years of stalking the fjords of Norway, she was crippled by British midget submarines and later destroyed in an air raid, lifting the shadow that had terrified Arctic sailors. The Luftwaffe, too, began to falter as Germany shifted resources to defend its crumbling front lines. By 1944, German air attacks on convoys had diminished significantly. Even the Soviets contributed by deploying icebreakers to guide the convoys into Murmansk and Arkhangelsk during the harshest months. These ships plowed through thick floes, carving paths where none seemed possible. For the merchant sailors who followed in their wake, it was often the difference between life and death. Convoys like JW58 in March 1944 demonstrated the improvement. Of 49 merchant ships, all reached their destinations safely, protected by one of the most powerful escort groups assembled during the war. The contrast with PQ-17 was staggering. What had once been nearly suicidal missions now became survivable, though still deadly. Yet even with these advancements, the Arctic remained unforgiving. Storms continued to batter ships, frostbite continued to claim fingers and lives, and the fear of drowning in icy waters never disappeared. The improvements saved thousands, but the memory of those earlier convoys, where survival was barely 1 in 10, haunted every sailor. They knew the statistics could shift against them at any moment. For many, every voyage north still felt like gambling with death. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world turned its attention to victory parades, peace treaties, and rebuilding nations torn apart by 6 years of war. But for the men of the Arctic convoys, there was no parade, no triumphant fanfare. Their battle had been fought in a place too remote, too merciless, and too hidden for the public to fully grasp. The Arctic was silent, and it kept its secrets. Thousands of sailors remained beneath those waters, entombed in shattered ships that still lie scattered across the seabed. To this day, they are unmarked graves, frozen monuments to sacrifice. For decades, their story was overshadowed by the great battles of Europe and the Pacific. Historians debated the strategies of Normandy, the turning points at Stalingrad, the carnage of Okinawa, while the Arctic convoys were often reduced to a footnote. Yet the Soviet Union never forgot. To the Russians, those convoys were lifelines, proof that their allies had not abandoned them in their darkest hour. Murmansk and Arkhangelsk hold memorials to the sailors who braved the ice, and each year ceremonies are held to honor the dead whose bodies were never recovered. For the families who lost loved ones, the legacy is far more personal. They live with absence, with the knowledge that the men they loved are still out there beneath the sea. For survivors, the legacy was silence. Many spoke little of their experiences, carrying memories too painful to share. When they did finally tell their stories in old age, their voices often shook as they described ships burning on black water, comrades slipping into the frozen depths, and the eerie quiet that followed. Winston Churchill once called the Arctic route the worst journey in the world. He wasn't exaggerating. It was a voyage where nature and enemy conspired equally to destroy, where survival was never guaranteed, and where 89% of sailors on doomed convoys never saw Russia's shores. Their legacy is not written in medals or glory, but in silence. The silence of the Arctic, where their bodies remain, and where history still whispers their names through the wind and ice.